Okay, so today we're convening to discuss an issue that is not common to our deliberations generally, but that is important enough for us to really look into how religion interfaces with equity for women. So we have three representatives of major religions, women who have excelled in their own faith, to share with us what we need to form opinions about what is happening in the U.S. today and how, if at all, we want to interface with the religious happenings in our time. Some of the things they say is that 1/5 of the U.S. public and 1/3 of the adults under 30 are religiously unaffiliated. And another interesting fact is that 206 faith-related groups advocate on Capitol Hill. So religion is busy in our public life, and how it affects us should be of interest to us. Finally, these documents that I picked at random from what they had on their website give you an idea of what's happening religiously in the United States. They tell you which faiths support abortion and which don't, and some data like that is useful for comparison's sake. To start us on this look at the religious landscape, I turn to Jan Cope, the canon, vicar of the Episcopal Church Cathedral that we see off on Wisconsin Avenue. Jan.
First, thank you to Carmen for the invitation and to all of you for engaging in this topic. Secondly, just to set straight the context from which I'm going to be coming. I'm not going to attempt to speak for all of Christendom.
They have one.
And so just know that I'll be speaking primarily as an Episcopal priest from my denomination, and also a little bit of a lens of the Episcopal Church being a part of the wider Anglican communion. You may know that the Episcopal Church is connected relationally with the Anglican communion. Probably the best known representative of all that is the Archbishop of Canterbury in the Church of England. And in other provinces around the communion, they might be known as the Anglican Church. But in the United States and a few other countries, we're known as the Episcopal Church. It's a little confusing, but we have relational branches in about 165 countries around the world. So just know I'm not going to try and do the broad stroke of history in the world in 20 minutes. Because Carmen set us up with some statistics, I wanted to touch base a little bit on that. And I was visiting with Hannah before we started, and interestingly enough, in the Episcopal Church, women have been ordained for about 40 years, which is the same in Judaism. And of course that all culminates with what was happening culturally, I think, in our country and around the world in terms of the women's movement, etc. And so just a brief look on where we are sort of 40 years later in the Episcopal Church. Currently, there are 2,471 ordained women compared to 4,188 men who are active in our sort of clergy pension process, which means that of the active clergy, about 37% are women. In terms of recently ordained and employed clergy, men represent 62%, and about 66% of all employed clergy in the Episcopal Church in the United States. Just in terms of wages, which is something I know everyone always looks at, recently ordained female clergy consistently made between $1,000 to $7,000 less than male clergy of the same age, and that women can also expect about a 1,766 smaller salary increase when changing parish positions than men. As a gross statistic, women clergy are consistently realizing smaller gains from taking new jobs than men. And in terms of our hierarchy, we have priests, which is what I am, a bishop who helps to oversee a diocese, and then we have archbishops. Now, I gave you some of the not so encouraging statistics. Let me focus in specifically in my context in Washington and in the Diocese of Washington. We have a female bishop. She is probably one of about 3% in the United States of diocesan bishops who are women. And in the broader Anglican Communion, the United States and a few countries represent one of about 38 provinces around the world. And there's only one female primate or archbishop, and that would be my primate and archbishop, Catherine Jefferts Schori. She's the only one who's an archbishop level all across the world. So know that my lens is pretty biased by me being a priest and the first female vicar at Washington National Cathedral, my diocesan bishop who is a woman, and my primate who is a woman. So know that my lens is going to be a lot different than some people in other places. So a little more on my context. Many people don't know that the National Cathedral only formalized a congregation 7 years ago. People have been worshiping there, for over 100 years, but it's only been within the last 7 that we formalized a congregation. I am the second vicar at the cathedral and the first woman. So my predecessor was obviously a guy. And despite the statistics of the unaffiliated and some of the more depressing, from my vantage point, overall data of declining membership across the board in major religious organizations, we've had an uptick in our membership, and in particularly with young adults. At the cathedral, we have a burgeoning young adult 20s and 30s group, over 500 on the listserv. That doesn't mean they're all sitting in the pews every Sunday. And they wouldn't necessarily, in response to a Pew survey, say that they're an Episcopalian or respond in that sort of affiliated way, but they very much consider themselves belonging. And I would be surprised if some of my colleagues here don't have some of the same things going within their traditions. And so know that in 40 years we've made some progress. We're obviously not there yet, and I'm going to speak just briefly a little bit more about that. But I'm very cognizant of the fact that we stand on the shoulders of people who blazed that trail 40 years ago and have continued to blaze that trail. And so for me, it's a hopeful sign of progress, but it's sort of an already but not yet. There's much more to be done. And part of what we have tried to do is really lift up leadership from our younger ranks, putting them in very visible places of leadership within the cathedral community, etc. A recent example of that is that we had our 20s and 30s group oversee our Thanksgiving basket drive. They set what they thought was an aggressive goal for them of 360 baskets. They came in with 432. And some of the leadership on that were women that we try and help lift up. I'm proud to say that One of the members of the 20s and 30s group went to her employer and ended up getting 100 turkeys donated. She stepped up to the plate, but she was empowered to do that. And I think that that's part of our responsibility, is when we have opportunities to lift up younger leadership, and particularly women, that we help empower them to use the gifts that God has given them. I think that we also have opportunities to be pretty visible examples of women who have achieved some success in our faith traditions, and to witness that for others. Women have been ordained in the Episcopal Church for 40 years in this country, but it's only been within the last couple of years that that's universally been the case in every place around our country. And it is not universally the case around the world. There are places in the Anglican Communion where a woman cannot be ordained. I've been in some of those places, and in some incredibly remote areas of Africa and some other places, and I purposefully wear my clergy collar. I'm not up in people's faces, but it's clear that I'm a priest. And I remember one experience a few years back, and I was in Malawi, where women are not ordained. And the bishop, who is very supportive, the bishop there was with me. And in a very rural village, some women and young girls came up and kind of looked at me at this strange oddity. I know I'm pretty strange looking, but it wasn't just me. It was the collar, and they couldn't figure that out. And so they went to the bishop and said, "Is she a priest?" And he said, "Yes, she is." And then, they were attached to me like glue. It was a powerful witness, without my saying a word, that this is a possibility. Maybe not now, maybe not today in your context, but know that this is a possibility for you. And we know that story from all of our different vocational lives, of just trying to say, this can be you too, and to try and get over some of those barriers. And I think one of the opportunities we have is not only to model, but to mentor, and I touched on that just a little bit ago. I highly recommend, if you haven't read it, this book, The Confidence Code, by Katty Kay and Claire Shipman. And it combines scientific research as well as firsthand accounts of, I think for so many women, it's really a matter of having the self-confidence in a culture that has some different examples out there, so to speak. And they, as journalists, talk about different times when a male colleague would jump out and say, "Well, I can cover that." And they might have held back because they felt they didn't have the depth of substantive experience to go in to report on something. And so they felt they didn't have the grounding, but they looked at their male colleague who had no grounding. And what was it that enabled him to say, "I can do this," and held them back? And I think that part of the opportunity that we have to mentor those who are coming up behind us is to say, of course you can do that. It's just a matter of, self-confidence and taking some risks. And part of what they say in this book is that we have a choice, often as women, to make less people-pleasing and perfectionism and more action and risk-taking. That's part of what that book is about, and I think that's part of what we can model and help mentor other people in doing. And another book that's been very instructive for me is just recently published. It's called Looking Forward, Looking Backward, 40 Years of Women's Ordination. Now, it tells the story in the Episcopal Church, but I would be shocked if it didn't mirror some of your stories in Judaism. And I just want to read one piece of that for you because it speaks to what I've been trying to say, and hopefully a lot more articulately than I've done it. The visibility of female priests and bishops during the latter 20th century as vocational models for girls and young women has been beneficial, and it's got a chart that talks about that. It shows the age of women's first sense of call to the priesthood, which has declined rapidly from earlier generations to around 20, similar to men. We've caught up with people believing this could be a possibility, this could be a vocational call for me. Many younger women also went to seminary in an era of more supportive attitudes towards feminism in its various expressions and had more female professors. A few were challenged or blocked in the ordination process because of their gender, already, but not yet. Mentoring is a form of grooming future leaders through informal networks. It's been a powerful way of passing on valuable knowledge and recommending clergy for key opportunities in the ministry. In other words, if we hear about openings in other strong pulpits, it's up to us to help identify other women who would be successful and a great blessing to whatever that congregation or community of faith may be. 40 years ago, older clergy would identify promising young men and occasionally women with the ability and drive to break fresh ground in the church. Mentoring was effective but also exclusive, appreciated but not necessarily expected. This is changing, especially among Gen X priests. The higher desire for mentoring among women may reflect a residual sense of a church's organizational culture and leadership structure still being largely male dominant. Yet the percentage of men and women who actually are mentored has been similar over the years. So it's changing, but we have to be part of that change in identifying others who would fit well into these opportunities. So let me just quickly conclude with my basic point. We've made progress, but there's much more required of each one of us. And a closing piece from the introduction of this book. I've long believed that one reason we study the past is to get a running start on the future. I'm persuaded that we can convert understanding of past events into insights that will illumine our future. Please join me as we learn from and with the assembled host of talented authors, scholars, pastors, storytellers, and leaders who've contributed to this volume. They have sobering, at times amusing, often challenging, and deeply instructive lessons to share. We each have work to do as we pursue the gospel of transformation. Emboldened by lessons that we have learned, let us move forward to celebrate the 40th anniversary of womenhood priesthood with smiles upon our faces. In answer to your question, are religions helping increase gender equity? Some, not enough. But I think that we're in a much better position to try and help make that a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now, I hope that we can help make that a reality too. Now we will hear from Rabbi Hannah Goldstein, who I thought was 19 years old when she walked in. And she has been the assistant rabbi at Temple Sinai in DC.
Yes, thank you. I'm not 19. So just, Carmen, thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here and humbled to be on this panel. And I am very aware of my age. As I was thinking and preparing for today, I was thinking about how the rabbinate that I am a part of and that I entered into is very much the product of a lot of other women's hard work, and the ease with which I can call myself a rabbi and sort of move easily in that world, mostly, is really because of the work of a lot of other women who fought for what I get to sort of do much more easily. And as I was thinking about the question, I was thinking about how I looked, are religions helping increase gender equity? And I initially thought, no. And that's probably not why you invited me to come here to just give a one-word answer. But part of one of the things that I discovered and sort of thinking and reading about this was the fact that so much of the changes that happen in the religious community were the outcome of changes that were happening all across the board. And it was a huge cultural shift, and the work that was happening in all different parts of society was what enabled, the gates to finally open so that we, and it all did sort of happen at the same time because of the powerful social forces that were at play in that time. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful for all of the work that was done. I feel like a lot of what I am going to say is like, yes, me too.
That's good.
Yeah, right. It's good. It's mostly good, sometimes not as good. So I also want to do a similar disclaimer, which is that I am a Reform rabbi. Judaism is broken into different denominations. So there's Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and there's a lot of gray area in between. There's an expression, if you have two Jews, you have three opinions. And so there's a great deal of diversity in the way that we practice our faith. And so while I want to be able to represent sort of a Jewish perspective, I also very much come from a Reform Jewish context in which women are empowered in all aspects of our worship and in our practice, which is not the case throughout the Jewish world, and it's quite different in other parts of the Jewish world. So I'm going to do the best I can to talk a little bit about some of the other ways of practicing Judaism and how gender has played into that, but I do come from a very particular context. I think, though, that in all of the Jewish world, there has been a great deal of change and a shift towards greater equity within the faith community, and I think that trickles out in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to talk about 4 short things. So the first thing is just a case study of Washington, D.C., which I think is actually a perfect city to sort of show where we were and where we are now. So I spoke to Mindy Portnoy, who's Rabbi Emeritus at Temple Sinai. She was there she just retired a couple of years ago, and she was in one of the first classes that ordained women at Hebrew Union College, which is the Reform Seminary. And when she was ordained in 1980, there was only one other female rabbi in the Washington area, and it was a woman who was working at Hillel, Mindy came and first worked at American University in Hillel, so she wasn't in a congregational context. And so in some ways it was a different dynamic. There was different questions, and she reflected that students were in some ways more open-minded, and it was a little bit different than going straight to the congregation. But she joined the Temple Sinai clergy in 1986. And she described her experiences of being a rabbi were a bit like being a Martian. People maybe had heard of them but didn't really think that they existed. And so every time she told anyone that that's what she did, it was really groundbreaking and revelatory, and people couldn't quite believe it. And she faced, in her rabbinate, she confronted all kinds of questions. What does a woman rabbi wear? What happens when a woman rabbi gets pregnant? All of those kinds of questions. And she was figuring it out because there weren't any mentors. So she wrote a book called Ima on the Bima, My Mommy is a Rabbi, in 1986. Ima means mom in Hebrew. Which was really the first of its kind. It was the first time that there was any kind of a children's book to talk about the experience of having a mom who is a rabbi. And I will say my dad's a rabbi, so I just a disclaimer. But so she reflected that it really was, she was, not constantly aware of being a pioneer, but it was very much a part of her experience. That most of the places that she went, she was the first female rabbi anyone had met in their life. And she also reflected that in DC, her network was more likely to be female clergy from other faith traditions, that she came together with other women who were confronting the same kinds of challenges of being female clergy, less likely than she was to, be in community with other rabbis who were men. So that was also interesting to me. And the last Mindy Portnoy thing that really struck me in the difference from my experience is she feels, this burden of being seen as representative of the whole, that one woman represented, all women rabbis, and so every sermon and every service and every experience that she created, or just going grocery shopping, she felt like she was burdened by representing, burdened and at times privileged by representing all women who were rabbis, because it was such a new idea, and she was an exemplar in that way. When she told me about it, it was mind-blowing, because I realized that I don't feel that way. I feel like I represent rabbis, I feel like I represent young rabbis, I represent Reform rabbis, but I don't feel like I represent women rabbis. And so to me, that was such a striking shift in the way that we experience being female rabbis now, as opposed to when Mindy was sort of helping to blaze that trail. Now in DC, there are women rabbis, and all of the major congregations have women assistant rabbis, associate rabbis, in the Reform and the conservative congregations. And remarkably, and I think this is really exciting, that we have at Ohev Shalom, which is an Orthodox synagogue. It's a liberal Orthodox synagogue, but they now have a Maharat on staff, which is sort of an Orthodox version of a rabbi, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But there's very few of them. She was in the first class, and she represents a huge, huge shift in the Jewish community. To have a female clergy member is something that is, and it's quite controversial, and there's a great deal of opposition, but the fact that she's here, I think, sort of shows that, Washington now is representative of the great deal of diversity of what women rabbis can be. So there's sort of two sides of the coin. One is the perspective from liberal Judaism, where it was easier to say, we're going to break from tradition. And then, Orthodoxy, which had a very particular attitude towards Jewish law, which said any decision that we make or any changes that we make have to be in accordance with the received tradition of the Torah and the Talmud. We need to find a textual way of creating an argument for women in leadership. Reform Jews were able to say, times have changed, we are changing with the times, we don't need to act in accordance with all of the received tradition. And even still, it took us a really long time for women to be rabbis. It was a conversation that happened for 100 years before a woman was ordained. The conversation started in Germany in the 1820s, but it was not until 1974 that the first woman was ordained at Hebrew Union College. She is not the first woman who was ordained. This is actually very important. She's oftentimes discussed as being the first woman who was ordained. There was actually, it is important to me to have everyone know Regina Jonas's name, who was actually the first woman ordained. She was ordained in Germany, and she was ordained in 1935. Unfortunately, it was not a great time in Germany, so she never had a congregational position, but she taught and she preached from the pulpit, and as things got worse, she filled in for rabbis and served their communities when they needed her, however she was able, and she died in Auschwitz in 1944, so her legacy for many years was lost. So she's not part of this conversation, so it's important to me to say her name and to teach you about her, because we didn't really know about her until actually the 1970s, when there was this new wave of focus around women in the rabbinate that suddenly, through some research, her name surfaced, and she was able to be more celebrated as one of the first women rabbis. And I would say that in the Reform context, it was just a lot easier, because it was hard. There's a lot of there was opposition, but it was still by the time the change happened, there was a lot of energy behind the change. All of the leadership of Hebrew Union College was in line and on board and supportive. So it was easier to ordain that first woman in 1974. There were attempts before that where women had been students and they were enrolled and they were denied ordination. Sometimes they finished the full course of study, and then in the last, when they got to the point of ordination, it became well, we'll call you a master of education and love, but we're not going to call you a rabbi. So it wasn't until 1974 that they made that change. And now, I don't have statistics, but my class when I was ordained was slightly more women than men, and the entire time that I was in rabbinical school, it was female dominated. There were more women than men in each class that was in HUC, Hebrew Union College, when I was in school. So there are a great deal of new women rabbis coming out right now. It is very different in the Orthodox context because they are working with, they have to work within a very strict legal framework, and in order to make any changes, they need to be able to defend it through Jewish law and Jewish legal precedent. I was talking about this with my dad, the rabbi dad, and he actually quoted, he said, I need to tell you I just heard this great quote from Cardinal O'Malley on 60 Minutes. When he was interviewed, he said, if I were founding a church, I'd love to have women priests, but Christ founded it, and what he has given us is something different. And I think that quote actually crystallizes a lot of the challenge when you're working in a halachic, which is a Jewish legal framework. There's even the desire to make change is not enough. You still have to figure out how to reconcile that change with the received tradition and with your past. And so the energy around this new position of Maharat there's a lot of Jewish legal underpinning that sort of says this is how we can do this. This is how a woman can take this role. And there is a great deal of pushback in the Orthodox Jewish community. The RCA, which is the Rabbinic Orthodox, it's the Rabbinic Council of America, I think. They are opposed to women taking these positions of leadership. So that's sort of the frontier that this is happening on right now. The last thing that I want to mention is the social justice component, because I think this is the way that we transcend our little universe of, Jewish women making progress within our own context, but how do religions actually serve as a force for equity in the greater world? And I would say that because there are more women in leadership in Jewish organizations, and because such a large part, particularly, I would say this is true across the board, is the prophetic call of working for justice. The issues that we are working for in Jewish organizations, and that work is animated by the needs and desires of women. So we have just a couple of examples. The Religious Action Center, which is right across the circle, which it's the hub of Jewish social action and legislative activity in Washington, has worked, it's worked in the secular sphere since 1961. It helped write the Civil Rights Act. It was written in the basement of the RAC. And they've worked strongly on reproductive rights and women's issues, all sort of through a Jewish framework, but it's all, they are working in the secular political world. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was the American Jewish World Service, which is another social justice organization that works through a Jewish lens, but it works with a global focus and works particularly in the global south. And their campaign right now is, it's called the We Believe campaign, and it's working to stop violence against women and girls, hate crimes against LGBT people, and also to end child marriage. And they're working to lobby Congress to pass VIVAWA, the International Violence Against Women Act. So this has, real legal, political ramifications outside of just the Jewish world. And I think that's where I'm going to stop.
Thank you. Great. And now we will hear from Donna Hakimian from Baha'i International, and hopefully that she will give us also a vision about Baha'i internationally, when we know you have done a lot.
Thank you very much. So I just wanted to, first of all, that's really interesting. I felt like I just could keep listening and listening. Now, I have to talk now. So, I just wanted to thank so much the organizers. Actually, one of the very first events I attended when I started this role was actually back when the meetings were on the other side of the circle. And really, I feel like I'm able to stand here and do what I'm doing because of a lot of the struggles and many years of struggles that all of you did in the women's rights movement. So I'm just very grateful to be here. So I'll share the first part of my remarks will be a little bit more formal, and then I'll go into a little bit more about what our office does, and then if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them as well. So as was mentioned, I'm the representative for gender equality and the advancement of women at the U.S. Baha'i Office of Public Affairs. So our office represents the U.S. Baha'i community with the U.S. government, with NGOs, with the media. And specifically, our office works in a couple of different areas. So one thing, unfortunately, because in a number of countries around the world, Baha'is face persecution, that really takes up a lot of the work we do, but that's absolutely not the sort of sole focus. In addition to that, there's the promotion of human rights in a number of different areas. For example, just this week was, or last week was the 25th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we've been very involved with those ratification efforts, as well as sustainable development. We do a lot of that work, as well as gender equality and the advancement of women, which is the area I work in. So just a little bit about my own context and background. So I was born in Iran to a Baha'i family, but at the age of 2, my family fled religious persecution. At the time, unfortunately, many thousands of Baha'is were being imprisoned and many were being killed. And so it's something that sadly Baha'is in Iran and other countries still face. And things like the denial of access to higher education is one of the things that Baha'is in Iran are still sort of struggling to have these basic rights be accepted. So I have a background in history and in women's studies. My graduate research was about Iranian Baha'i women who were prisoners of conscience. So they were arrested and imprisoned simply for their membership in the Baha'i faith. And I actually looked at the question of what role did their religious convictions play in their, basically not recanting their faith. Because they were told, if you simply say you are not a Baha'i, you'll be free to go. But these women endured torture. For one of the women I interviewed, her husband was killed. So the question was, well, what was this thing that you weren't, willing to give up, really at the cost of, in some cases, your own life? So that was my graduate research. And then now I work on a number of really interesting issues. I work with Sue, we partner on some issues. Specifically, we work both at the policy and advocacy sort of space. So for example, you mentioned IVAWA, so we've actually worked with some people from RAC at the Interfaith Coalition against domestic and sexual violence, as well as things such as gender equity in education, the promotion of women and girls in STEM, stopping sexual assaults on college campuses. There's been a lot of buzz around that with the White House It's On Us campaign. So those are just a few of the things that we're involved with. And then actually just last week I came back from New Delhi, where I was at the second Men Engage Global Symposium, Men and Boys for Gender Justice, which was really interesting because, as I'm sure many of you know, there was that really horrific rape case there in 2012. And then they sort of selected Delhi because they've had this amazing movement of men and women working together to really call for gender justice. And so I just have come back from that. And then another conference in the lead up to the CSW in March, which was at the UN in Geneva. So I'm still a little jet lagged. But I thought I would start my remarks by just sharing a little bit about what the Baha'i faith is. So it's sort of relatively a newer faith tradition. And some of you may know a little bit about it. Some of you, it's totally fine if you've never even heard of it. So it's the youngest of the world's independent religions, and it's based on written volumes by its twin founders, the Bab and Baha'u'llah. It originated in Iran in the mid-19th century. And the sort of central purpose of the Baha'i faith is the unification of humanity. So Baha'i precepts outline the gradual evolution and development of human society towards collective just, peace, and unity. And a critical sort of element and message of the Baha'i faith is the equality of women and men. So Baha'u'llah, the Prophet founder, has written All should know, and in this regard attain the splendors of the sun of certitude, and be illumined thereby. Women and men have been and will always be equal in the sight of God. So the son of the prophet founder, Baha'u'llah, his name was Abdul Baha, and he has also written extensively on the link between gender equality and peace. So in the Baha'i faith, we believe that peace is actually not possible until the equality of women and men is really kind of universally accepted and lived reality. So he has written, so it will come to pass that when women participate fully and equally in the affairs of the world, when they enter confidently and capably the great arena of laws and politics, war will cease, for women will be the obstacle and hindrance to it. And in terms of the way leadership is in the Baha'i faith, we actually do not have clergy, but we have locally, nationally, and internationally elected governing bodies. So in Washington, for example, DC, there's 9 elected individuals who we don't do electioneering in the sort of sense that in DC you'll sometimes see where people will put their names to be elected, but it's done through private ballot. I happen to serve not by any kind of appointment, but I was elected to serve in my local community in Falls Church, Virginia. But every year there is an election, so I could not serve next year, for example. And one thing that's really interesting to me is sort of how this principle, as you were mentioning, about social justice is really critical. So we have these beliefs, but a question that I always wonder is, well, how can we, put them into action? So it's not something I necessarily have the answer for, but I always try and use my beliefs, not something that I just, have in my home and then when I leave the house it turns off, but how can those actually prompt me to do good in the world? And specifically in the issue that I feel very strongly about, carry out, and bring forth a world where women and men live as equals. So what I thought I would do, as again I have a background in history, is share 3 individuals from Baha'i history. They're not saints per se, but they're individuals that I think use this message of gender equality in really interesting ways. So the first individual I'd like to discuss, her name was Tahireh. She was born in Persia in 1817, and she was known both for her literary gifts. She was a poet, she was a theologian, and she's also very well known for publicly unveiling, removing her veil in the year 1848. So right now we may think, okay, well, what's the big deal? We live in a society, some people wear the veil, but largely, none of us in this room are. But at that time, the context in Iran was such that there were even different door knockers for men and for women. Lest a man answer for a woman and a woman answer for a man, the society was completely segregated. And she was actually one of the early leaders of the Babi faith, which was the predecessor to the Baha'i faith. And so she was very much in a public role, and I personally have her as one of my own heroines. And sadly, in August of 1852, she was sentenced to death. She was strangled by her own veil, was used to strangle her. And her last known remarks were having said, "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women," which is something to me that is very powerful, because I don't know if you saw, but even just a few weeks ago in Iran, a woman was executed. So really it's a very real struggle, and it's something that I think to this day people around the world are still trying to, have their basic rights of, how they dress and what they say. And so her story, while it ends, on a very sad note, was amazing that she was able to be in these public spaces, to speak, to be, analyzing religious texts in a context which was really, everything was sort of against that. So to fast forward, I would like to then share the story of a woman named Dr. Susan Moody. She was an early American Baha'i. She was born in Chicago in 1851, and then she traveled to Iran in the year 1909. So one thing that I find really interesting about Dr. Susan Moody, well, a couple of things. First of all, she became a physician later in life. And so I know sometimes in our society we think, well, older women or aging women, what role do they have to play? But she was amazing because she went later in life, traveled to Persia, and she set up some of the very first gynecological clinics for women and schools for girls. So in that time, if some of you again are aware of the sort of sociocultural context of Persia at the time, medicine was actually, especially mental health, was not treated as something that was curable in the sense of like going to a clinic, whereas if a person was seen as being possessed by a demon, for example. And so she went and offered free, well, I don't know about the cost of it, but in terms of she opened the doors to one of the very first clinics. And she also faced great persecution. There are primary sources that I've read of her time there where she would be sort of chased down the streets, rocks would be thrown at her. And interestingly, an American soldier was actually sent to protect her. His name was Major Embry, and he was sadly killed, actually, and he's buried in Arlington Cemetery. But there are photos, if you look at some of the original texts, where she's actually standing with a group of male physicians. She's standing at the front. And what was very interesting in some of the research that I'd done on her is that it was very different than sort of a colonial compound where she would live and then sort of be far away from the rest of the citizens. She actually lived with an Iranian family. She learned to speak Persian, and then she died in Iran. So Dr. Susan Moody, like Tahereh, is another individual from Baha'i history who I feel took these principles of gender equality and really use them to good ends in terms of social justice. And the last woman that I'll share is somebody that is very, very close to my heart. She was born in 1965, and her name is Mona Mahmoudnejad. She was executed in 1983. She was imprisoned at the age of 17, and really her main crime was to have been a teacher of children's classes. So again, as I mentioned, my graduate research was about the resilience of these women. So I had the great fortune of actually interviewing a woman who was in prison with Mona. And what was amazing to me here is a 17-year-old woman, eventually she knew that, her life could possibly come to an end. But here is an excerpt from some of her memoirs. She wrote, "The prosecutor looked at me, astounded, and said, 'Young girl, what do you know about religion? Is there a better proof of my faith than the fact that I was taken out of school to be brought here and undergo long hours of trials? Can't you see that it is my belief that has given me the confidence to stand in your presence and answer your questions?'" So of these three women, two of them lost their lives in the pursuit of gender equality. But their story I share with you not to make you sad, but to really remind us that actually in many parts of the world pursuing gender equality can be very dangerous, but I share it to inspire us, to show that religion can actually be something that promotes gender equity. So just the final part of my talk, wanted to share a little bit about how we work at our office. So as I mentioned, we both work in a policy and advocacy space, but we also work at the grassroots. So just this past Saturday at the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center, we had a sort of domestic violence training, and that's a really, a critical thing. I'm not sure of the work that my other two colleagues do, but like any community, we're still a community living in this world. And we're still trying to understand what gender equity looks like. And so work at the grassroots is really critical, but again, we also work, for example, supporting the Violence Against Women Act, working with national coalitions to support gender equity in education, and just really happy to be here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We have really heard from three faith orientations, and there are lots of lines that seem to merge together. And the article that we distributed talks about two perspectives. One, a Catholic perspective, and another, a perspective of an organization created basically to allow women to aspire to higher offices. So the floor is open for questions. Yes?
So we heard from two of you specifics about what your organization is doing, working for social justice, but we haven't really heard from the Anglican Episcopalian perspective.
It will vary from church to church, but we too have an advocacy office on the Hill and work on a variety of social issues. One that, whether it's, immigration reform or violence or some of those issues. Hannah and I were just speaking. She is coming to the cathedral, representing the faith community in a vigil that the cathedral will be hosting on December December in a couple of weeks. That is around the time of the anniversary of the Newtown shooting. One of the areas with which the cathedral has particularly taken a very strong and public stance is anti-gun violence. And we have been a part of and also helped create any number of coalitions on that. I mean, that just cuts across the board in terms of one of the social issues that this country in particular, I think, is grappling with in terms of violence. But, we're involved in, the environment, a whole host of issues.
Any other? Yes?
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment. I'm very much involved with the Jewish community, and it was really fascinating to hear the history. I know some of the women who really initiated, and certainly the conservative movement, the inclusion of women in the rabbinate, and they were graduate students. One became a professor of Jewish history at Yale, another one teaches Talmud, which was very much a male-focused study at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I wanted to say something about the Muslim community. I'm vice president of Global Peace Services USA. We work in peace building and conflict resolution. And one of our board members was a Palestinian observant woman who wore a hijab. And the word veil is a little murky. Hijab really is a scarf that covers your hair. It's not something that only shows your eyes. And she invited me to teach a Sunday school class at her mosque in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I worked as a sociologist with a colleague from Pakistan who was very active in her mosque and Sunday school. So it's really important to understand the role of Muslim women in American mosques. It is not the same as being in a mosque in Cairo or in Yemen. And they are playing an important role. There's an Americanization of the Muslim community, and it would be great sometime to have a woman.
Any other comment? Question? Yes? Okay.
Well, I was in San Francisco, and I think I mentioned to you last time, I saw the Ai Weiwei exhibit where he has taken people who have been persecuted around the world and done their portraits in Legos. So if there's any way you can get to see this exhibit, it's pretty amazing. But I was struck by the number of Baha'i women still imprisoned in Iran. And luckily my daughter speaks Farsi at the second grade level. So one of the strategies of this exhibit was people would write postcards to people who were imprisoned. So my daughter wrote to these women, and I'm wondering what you know about the current status of Baha'i women in Iran.
Sure. Well, we kind of have, the director of our office works very closely on those issues with the U.S. government. So I think the latest numbers, how many people are in prison, Baha'is are in prison right now, it's like 100
It's roughly about 110, and a little bit less than half of them are women.
And the thing that was amazing to me, again, like this question of how the very thing that they were being imprisoned for, when I would interview the women, they would say, you know, when they would break into our homes and, you know, confiscate our belongings, they suddenly felt this like very strong spiritual strength. So it was this thing of, yes, it's sad, you know, that they're being imprisoned for their faith, but the faith was also an incredible source of like, not just, oh, you know, it made me feel good. I mean, literally, it gave them the ability to withstand, you know, really tremendous persecution. And so, of course, I mean, we really want for all of the people, Baha'is and everybody suffering in Iran to be free and to be able to live freely. But I was just so struck by, you know, sometimes during the interviews where I would break down, some of the women would say, you know, those are actually the moments in my life where I actually became a lion and went from this very timid person and just became so strong. So it's a very strange thing, you know, how suffering can really give us a lot of strength. But obviously, you know, in terms of the advocacy we do, I think it's really, we would hope that that the UN and the US government, you know, continue the support of human rights in Iran.
Hannah, I'd like to ask this issue of voyeurism of one rabbi observing women in a sacred bath context. How do religions deal with aberrations like that? I mean, we're supposed to be people of God, and some of them transgress.
So I think it's a sad abuse of power. I also think one of the incredible things that's come out of it is the activism of women. Actually, that there is not up until now there have not been women who have been part of the conversion process in Orthodox Judaism. So they don't sit on the Beit Din, which is the court of rabbis who you have to sort of go before you immerse in the mikveh as the final step before conversion. And there are not women in the mikveh. You know, it is a very male-driven process. And as a result of, you know, what happened at Kesher Israel, there's been a great deal of women coming forward and saying, we need to change this process. We need to empower women to be part of these conversations, even in the absence of having women rabbis in Orthodox Judaism, because for the most part, there still aren't women rabbis in Orthodox Judaism. We need to have we need to have women who are present in this conversion process. We need to have a voice. The RCA, the rabbinic, I need to get the name right. I'm going to get it. I have it in my notes. Hold on. Rabbinic Council of America. That's what I thought. Okay. Rabbinical. That's what it was. I couldn't get it. Okay. The Rabbinical Council of America. They're changing their council of who is part of discussing conversion on a national level, and there are women who have been appointed to that council. So there have actually been, sort of similar to what you were saying, on the face of something that's quite sad and negative and was very hurtful. There has been some positive changes, I think, that we've seen come out of it, because it really has raised the consciousness about, you know, the absence of women's voices in a process that is quite intimate and very much, you know, sort of, we need women to be part of that. So there has been change on that front.
Any other questions? Yes?
I hate to repeat something that I can't verify, but I remember hearing something on the radio that the religions that are doing well are the ones that don't include women. Is that fair? I mean, have you heard anything about that? Growing religions are the ones that tend not to be inclusive of women. Is there any? I didn't know enough.
In the clergy, because obviously.
Yes, in the clergy. You know, and I just didn't know enough to say I think someone should challenge that, or because I don't know.
So in the Jewish context, actually, the Pew Research, they also wrote a study of the Jewish community that came out last year, and it was very widely read and blogged about if you read the blogs that I read, but you probably don't. But But one of the biggest, I mean, the Orthodox community, and particularly the very traditional, you know, sort of Black Hat Brooklyn community is rapidly growing. You know, there's a huge part of it is just family size and the number of children. You know, they are reproducing at a rapid level and they are completely replacing themselves and beyond. Whereas most liberal Jewish families have 2 kids, 1 to 3 maybe, as opposed to 12 in Crown Heights. So it's, you know, that is pretty good for your numbers. And so it's, I mean, that is, so statistically in the Jewish community, that is the population that is rapidly growing.
Any other question?
So is that sustainable? In, you know, really, in because the bigger families used to be a reflection of you need these people to work with farms, or you know, you need lots of worker bees. And is that sustainable in today's society, do you think?
I don't think that they live 100% in today's society.
Okay.
Choosing my words carefully. I think, so it's a very particular, it's a very closed and very particular kind of world. And it'll be interesting to see what happens when these, you know, as this continues to grow and expand. And interesting, in Israel, some of the very traditional Jews, the men study all day, and in a climate where women are able to work outside of the home, in some very traditional families, women are going out to work in the high tech industry, or they're doing jobs and supporting their families because the men are studying all day and they're not able to support their families. So that's an interesting sort of inversion of empowerment.
Well, I want to let you know that I've attended all the world conferences on women of the United Nations, starting in '75 in Mexico City, where Ellen and I walked the streets of Mexico, sometimes lost. And then Copenhagen, then Kenya, and then Beijing. And Baha'i was always there. It was very interesting to see the lobbying capacity on issues, particularly of survival and so on. And the Vatican was always there, largely opposed to the kinds of issues that women were trying to expand on. And we also had a group of women, generally religious, but associated with violence and so on, that helped shape some of the resolutions and so on. I don't remember the Episcopal Church being at any of those meetings, although I do know that sometimes we do international events and so on. But one of the important areas, I think, for people who are interested in the religious aspect of public service and public legislation is to help with their advocacy programs. The Episcopal Church does have a lobbying arm up on Capitol Hill, and many of the churches have their offices there by the Supreme Court, and they try to engage the people from their congregations in sending messages and so on. So that's an important way of adding our voice to the right things. Not that they're always right, but often we need to find numbers in order to be able to affect the outcomes. I think this has been an outstanding opportunity for us to hear from you, and we thank you for taking the time to come and share your wisdom with us.
I was just wondering if each of you could comment on what your goals and perspectives are on reproductive rights and abortion.
Reproductive rights, all except for the Orthodox, which is reproductive, like, there's much more nuance here, but, even in Jewish legal, sort of traditional Jewish legal texts in the Talmud, there's cases wherein to save the life of the mother, an abortion is mandated, or something like that. So there is, the most traditional Jewish sources would say that abortion is appropriate in some cases. And in liberal Judaism, we support a right to choose.
So again, the story of Dr. Moody to me was indicative of like the emphasis on women's health in the Baha'i faith. So in 1909, she went to set up these early clinics for women. So again, I may not know all the details, but from what I understand, it's really left up to the women and to decide on, what the right approach or in terms of abortion, not in specific context, but yeah, I think that's kind of the thing. I mean, we do believe that the soul at the time of conception links with the body, so that is one piece of it, but then absolutely, in terms of specifics around that, it's left up to the discretion of the woman.
Well, thank you, and on that note, I think we have Miss Magazine to be presented to each of you. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for coming,
Thank you very much.
and thank you so much, our audience, for coming on a day when it's too close to the Thanksgiving holiday. But let's really revel in the fact that you three are succeeding in your respective faith, and we wish you the best for the future.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.